جزاكم الله خيرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلوات وأتم التسليمات على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. I would like to open the presentation with two prefaces. One is that this is a historical study, and therefore I have not made any conclusion by giving juristic preference to one opinion over the other. I have made some conclusions which I will share inshallah ta'ala at the end. My focus is on the legal arguments behind the various opinions in post-Mughal India on the issue of riba or financial interests in a Darul Harb or non-Muslim land. Of course the arguments and the details of these arguments are vast. And my initial study, I perceived the number of resources to be fewer than I came across. So it would be very challenging to encompass all of the legal arguments. I will try to do my best, inshallah, in the limited time available. Basically, this whole issue begins in 1807 of the Common Era, which is about 4 years after the first British East India troops enter into the Mughal capital of Delhi. At the time, the preeminent scholar of Delhi is a man by the name of Shah Abdul Aziz, who was the son of the great Mujaddid Shah Waliullah. Shah Abdul Aziz, he's a polymath, of course, as has been mentioned before, like his father. He issues a crucial and decisive fatwa. And it's unequivocally decided that India has effectively transferred from Darul Islam to Darul Harb. He states actually in one of the fatwa, quoting the aforementioned in the previous speeches, the fatwa al-Alamgiriyah. He says that in the chapter on conquest by non-Muslims in the fatwa al-Alamgiriyah, that know that Darul Harb becomes Darul Islam under one condition, and the opposite would apply of course as well, the demonstration or idhar of Islamic rule therein. In other words, the idhar of ahkam. Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani states in Az-Ziyadat, according to Abu Hanifa, Darul Islam becomes Darul Harb only upon the fulfillment of three conditions. The first is that non-Muslim rulings or ahkam are enforced in a manner of widespread proclamation ala sabil ijtihad, and that judgments are made therein not on the basis of Islamic rulings. The second condition is that such land also be adjacent to other Darul Harb, and that no Islamic nation come between the two, or Muslim nation come between the two. The third is that no believer nor dhimmi therein remains in a state of security procured by the security, or aman, that was established for them before the conquest of the non-Muslims, a security given to the Muslim due to his Islam, or to the dhimmi due to the covenant of protection, or dhimma. Shah Abdul Aziz Rahmatullah Alayhi's view was that all of these aforementioned conditions, these three conditions, had been fulfilled. So, therefore, one was not only required to now consider India non-Muslim domain, it was also necessary to consider all of the possible legal mandates and consequences of such a domain. Of course, one such consequence was the issue of financial interest in dealings with non-Muslims. And I say dealings with non-Muslims because the issue in the Hanafi madhab is of the permissibility of interest between Muslims and non-Muslims in a non-Muslim domain in accordance with the dominant view of the madhab, which is the view of Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad, or the Tarafain. The contrary opinion is that of Abu Yusuf, which is in accordance with the Jumhur, Jumhur meaning Imam Malik, Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, which is impermissibility of riba in Darul Harb and in Darul Islam. So the Shah Abdul Aziz declares permissible interest between Muslims and non-Muslims regardless of whether the Muslim is receiving or giving the money interest. Now of course Shah Abdul Aziz's ruling of permissibility was contingent upon the declaration of India being Darul Harb. And in that opinion he is not alone. In the early 1800s we have a number of prominent personalities, including his student and brother Shah Rafiuddin Dehlawi Rahmatullah Alayhi, and Qadi Thanaullah Panipati, who passes away 3 years later in 1810. They both also declared unequivocally India to be Darul Harb. In the Bengal, Haji Shariatullah, who is the founder of the Fara'idi reform movement, he also declares Bengal to be Darul Harb. And in the Sindh, in Sindh, scholars like Ibrahim Tatwi, Abdurrahman Tatwi, and Makhdoom Muhammad Tatwi also issued fatwas along similar lines about Sindh in particular. And then, of course, a decade later, in the 1820s, Sayyid Ahmad Brelvi and the nephew Shah Abdul Aziz, Sayyid Shah Ismail Dehnawi Rahmatullah alayh, they initiate a jihad movement that was based on the conviction of Sayyid Ahmad Shahid that, quote, presently in 1233, which is 1817, the major portion of India has become Darul Harb. It's well known that in 1857, during the uprising, 34 leading scholars issued a fatwa declaring India to be Darul Harb. And this is, given the circumstances where it was known now that the British had intention to massacre the population of Delhi. So they offered unequivocal fatwa similar. And during that time also you have scholars like Maulana Qasim Nanotwi and Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi Rahmatullah alayh. They also made similar declarations. But of course, this was not a unanimous consensus. We do have a number of scholars in the 1800s, like the British loyalist Maulvi Karamat Ali, who publicly declared British India to be Darul Islam. Maulana Abdul Hayy Lakhnawi's name came up. He also, interestingly, declared India to be Darul Islam, but on different grounds. He believed that 3 conditions that were mentioned by Shah Abdul Aziz were not completely fulfilled. He believed that because some Islamic rules were still applicable, Muslims also were referred to by non-Muslim court judges on a number of civil legal issues. He believed that we cannot consider India to be a Darul Harb. Maulana Ahmad Reza Khan Brelvi, the head of the Brelvi tradition, he similarly claimed that because Muslims in India are free to observe the Eid Salah and the Jummah Salah, and they're able to give the Adhan, he still believed that Hindustan or India was Darul Islam. But it's interesting because the line of reasoning that Maulana Lakhnawi and Ahmad Reza Khan Brelvi that they offer, it seems to assume that any application of Islamic rules indicates that a place would be Darul Islam, whereas most jurists agree that the condition for a Darul Islam is the unrestricted ability to apply any and all Islamic laws, even if such laws are never applied by even a Muslim ruler. But the unrestricted ability must be found. And that's why most of the scholars of the subcontinent seem to agree on this issue. In the Deobandi tradition, there was the great polymath Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi. He is actually, of the scholars of the Deobandi tradition, the most recognized for his hesitation to declare India Darul Harb. He has 2 treatises on the subject. In one called Rafi al-Bank and Manafi al-Bank, he establishes doubt in the classification of India as a Darul Harb, and then he also gives preference to the opinion of Abu Yusuf Rahmatullah alayh on the impermissibility of financial interest in Darul Harb. But his own elder, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, he has a risala also called Faisalatul A'lam fi Darul Harb wa Darul Islam. In that he asserts, and he says, I'm going to quote him, that, and he's very vehement in his declaration of India as Darul Harb. He says that first it must be understood that considering any land Darul Islam or Darul Harb pivots on the idea that either the Muslims or the non-Muslims have authority or ghalba therein. On this basis, any city in which the government is under the authority of Muslims is called Darul Islam, as is mentioned in Jami' al-Rumuz. And then to skip forward, he says, otherwise one may not label a place Darul Islam purely based on the idea that Muslims reside therein and are able to observe the distinctive Islamic practices or the Sha'air Islamiyah with the permission of non-Muslims. Since there is no consideration for a nation purely on the basis of Muslims residing there and observing the distinctive Islamic practices through the permission of non-Muslims. Similarly, for a place to be occupied by non-Muslims, or for them to observe their distinctive non-Muslim practices with the permission of Muslims, or for them to make public in their obliviousness, will not make any difference in the nation being considered Darul Islam. As in both cases, this authority and dominance of such people is not found. Consideration is on the basis of dominance, ghalba, not on mere presence, wujud, or appearance, dhuhur. So Maulana Gangohi finds it very odd that people will declare such India Darul Harb. He says that essentially necessitates that one would have to declare France and England and Germany, because Muslims reside there and are able to observe certain practices. It's inconceivable that they would be Darul Islam. But you know, Maulana Gangohi rahmatullah alayhi, despite going to great lengths in his Faysalat al-A'lam to argue that India was Darul Harb, he does not continue the discussion with the issue of financial interest. There are a number of reasons why this is possible. Compare that to Shah Abdul Aziz. Shah Abdul Aziz, the majority of his fatwa which discuss Darul Harb are also discussing the issue of financial interest. In fact, in the previous quote that I mentioned, Shah Abdul Aziz's discussion of the conditions for the transfer of a land to Darul Harb is simply a preface for his response to an inquiry or istifta into the application of the ruling of permissibility of financial interest in India to both giving money and interest as well as to receiving it. So he was given a question that if India is Darul Harb, is it permissible to give and receive financial interest? To which he replied, the books of Islamic law are general in their phrasing, hence inclusive of both those who give and receive wealth and interest. And then he quotes the riwayah or the narration of Maf'ud that there is no la riba bayn al-muslimi wal-harbi fi Darul Harb. And then he says that Qadi Thana'ullah has penned an explanation for the permissibility of paying riba in a treatise of his, though this faqir does not recall it at the moment. However, it is evident that receiving interest from a non-Muslim resident of Darul Harb is lawful. The reason is that a kafir harbi's wealth is mubah or legally unprotected, provided that in the acquisition of the wealth of the kafir harbi there is no possibility of a breach of covenant. So, you know, Shah Abdul Aziz addresses this question that if one were to question why is it that the non-Muslims are not able to, or why are they prohibited from interest in Darul Islam? So he explains that in the case of a kafir dhimmi residing in Darul Islam, financial interest is unlawful because of the fear of popularization of financial interest. That in Darul Islam, if non-Muslims were permitted to engage in interest amongst themselves, that would popularize in interest-based dealings, and this is not because non-Muslims are prohibited from interest in a Darul Harb. But it's interesting that despite his arguments in favor of permissibility, Shah Abdul Aziz rahmatullah alayhi, he does offer a crucial warning. He states clearly that Muslims should not unnecessarily give money and interest to a kafir harbi. He also appears apprehensive that a broad Muslim engagement in interest-based transactions would negatively affect the community's identification with the Sha'air Islamiyya, or the distinctive Islamic practices, due to which he reminds Muslims that the Jummah prayer in Darul Harb is still valid if a Muslim ruler or hakim is appointed therein by the non-Muslim government. And then he continues, if the non-Muslim government doesn't appoint a Muslim hakim, then they must appoint the Muslim hakim by themselves by mutual consensus. And if they're not able to do so, then they still must pray the Jum'ah and repeat Dhuhr or pray Dhuhr afterwards to be precautious. And this warning is quite revealing to me. I think that it demonstrates that not only is he concerned, it demonstrates not only his concern for the preservation of Muslim identity, but it also demonstrates a willingness to publicize the view of the permissibility of financial interest, despite his recognition of the broader implications and potential dangers of declaring India Darul Harb. So he's well aware that people might, popularize this opinion, and there are certain negative implications, but that doesn't prevent him from issuing the fatwa. Other scholars didn't seem to agree with this. Maulana Gangohi rahmatullah alayhi, who wrote this detailed treatise on India being Darul Harb, he didn't publicize his opinion. Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani claimed that Maulana Gangohi's view was actually of permissibility, but that he did not publicize his opinion in view of the public interest. And he claims this quite clearly, that he was of the opinion, but he didn't publicize it because of maslahah. And in fact, Maulana Madani himself was of the view of permissibility. Most people don't know that. He also had his reservations. I mean, he didn't believe that because with Hindus that Muslims should engage with them in interest-based transactions. But he did say that because many Indian banks were owned and controlled by European non-Muslims, who spent much of their acquired profits in support of Christian missionary work, not accepting wealth accrued through interest from them would entail a significant harm to the Muslim community. In fact, he claimed that Islamic legal experts had ruled it was necessary, not just permissible, but it was necessary to take such interest money and then to either spend it as charity on impoverished Muslims or to utilize it elsewhere. In any case, he said, it is preferable to cast the money into the sea than to allow it to remain in the banks. Yet when it came to taking interest from Hindus, Madani stated that the ulama were still undecided on the issue. They feared that in the case of Indian non-Muslims, circulating a fatwa of permissibility would lead to the popularization of interest-based transactions amongst Muslims more than between Muslims and non-Muslims. Madani therefore understood it to be wiser to advise Muslims to understand financial interest in all of its forms to be prohibited and to be restrictive in their spending and to avoid loans in the first place. He advised them not to assist the enemies of their nation by giving them profits through their wealth. Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri is a name very much recognized even outside the subcontinent. He held a similar view on the issue of both Darul Harb and financial interest. In 1349 Hijri, his student Maulana Ahmad Reza Bijnori asked him candidly, if Hindustan is Darul Harb, is it then permissible to receive money and interest from non-Muslims? Allama Kashmiri replied, it is permissible. Bijnori then asked, is the money attained through means of fasid or imperfect transactions permissible? He replied, yes, not only are fasid transactions permissible, but batil transactions or invalid transactions are permissible as well. Although fatwa is not given on this because it is feared that people will no longer recognize that financial interest is unlawful in the Sharia. On the exact status of the legal status of Indians, there seems to be a slight difference of opinion among Allama Kashmiri and Allama Madani on whether or not Muslims are considered asir or captives. But I'll skip that for now. Maulana Bijnori actually makes an important clarification. He identifies why there are certain misconceptions about this idea. He thinks that many people might confuse this as sort of a hypocrisy when it comes to permitting or impermitting financial interest in one land as opposed to the other. And he quotes the verses of Surah Ma'idah on the issue of the punishment for murder or killing as a clear indication or evidence that there is a differentiation between the rules of Darul Harb and Darul Islam. And he extends that then therefore to the idea of the protection of wealth. So he establishes that there are essentially two types of isma in Islamic law. We understand that people are ma'soom, are protected in life and in wealth, but there are two types of protection or isma. Isma mu'thima, or protection, the violation of which is sinful. And then there's what he calls isma muqawwima, or the protection, the violation of which is both sinful and legally punishable. So he says that the first type of protection, or isma mu'thima, is a right acquired upon merely accepting Islam. But the second type, or isma muqawwima, is a right that requires the power and authority of a Muslim government or a Darul Islam. It is noteworthy that in the writings of scholars like Madani, Bijnori, Uthmani, Maulana Dhafar Ahmad Uthmani, and Maulana Munazir Ahsan Gilani, that the vulnerable condition of the Muslims living in non-Muslim lands was at the forefront of their minds. While exploring the issue of India as Darul Harb and the issue of financial interest, they strongly considered the momentous loss of property, wealth, financial strength, and political authority that characterized colonial rule. After 1857, for example, Allama Bijnori reminds us that the British held special resentment for the Muslims. The life, the property, the wealth were constantly in danger, and when they suffered great losses to life, residence, or business, the government did not provide any relief. Now, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi was a scholar who, when he struggled between the tension between the precautionary fatwa of prohibition and prioritizing facilities or considerations of political and economic strength, Maulana Thanwi seemed to prioritize or to prefer the precautionary fatwa. He therefore gives legal preference to the position of Abu Yusuf rahmatullahi, and on the basis of a number of proofs and principles. He has a risala called Rafi al-Dhank al-Masail al-Bank, which is a concise fatwa that opens with 7 muqaddimat or prefaces, and I want to just go through them inshallah briefly. The first is very interesting. He cites Durr al-Mukhtar to establish the validity of tarjih. In other words, he establishes the validity of his tarjih on the basis of the strength of evidence, on the condition that the scholar giving preference possesses the capability to understand the strength of legal arguments. The second preface is that he reminds readers that the issue of financial interest between Muslims and Harbi non-Muslims is an ikhtilafi issue, or an issue in which the imams of the madhab differ. In the third preface, he quotes the legal maxim that assistance in sin is also a sin. In the fourth preface, Tanwi asserts that many legal rulings are built on the principle that it is necessary to abstain from the popularization of any statement or action that may become a means for another falling into sin, when it is not a level of dire necessity or darura. The fifth preface, which is an addendum to the fourth, asserts that it is necessary to avoid situations that lead to suspicion and accusation. The sixth preface says that since there are many effective causes of something's prohibition, the absence of one does not entail the absence of others. And then lastly, Maulana Tanwi clarifies that if someone abstains from something that has been declared permissible in a fatwa, that should not be construed as opposition to the author of the fatwa. So he's saying, I'm not opposing Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad because they didn't make it obligatory to take interest. So his tarjih is not to be considered a contradiction to the opinion of Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad. So then he reminds readers that Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad permitted financial interest only conditionally. Number one, the land had to be Dar al-Harb, and the scholars, he says, don't have an agreement on this issue. Number two, the transaction had to be with the Harbi, and he argued, how can you guarantee that if you're taking a loan from a bank in non-Muslim lands, that some of the depositors are not Muslims, whose wealth will be mixed with the wealth